The term psychopath literally means psychologically sick, and that's not really what a psychopath is. They're not sick.
I'm so curious about that.
Today, we're cutting through the online noise with renowned personality disorder expert and author, Dr. Peter Salerno.
We are diving deep into the true clinical mechanics of narcissism, from calculated manipulation tactics to unexpected treatments.
Stick around to discover what's really happening inside the mind of a narcissist.
What you're looking for in a narcissist is somebody who is extremely invested in themselves, how people are going to perceive them, somebody who feels entitled to special treatment. These people are really charismatic and charming. They know how to seduce you. They know how to bait you. They study someone in advance and get a lot of information about them so that when the first encounter happens, the person almost feels they've known them for a very long time.
I think there's also this other side of the coin that isn't talked about as much.
Some of these individuals are actually pleased with themselves, and they like their self-concept and they like their lifestyle, and it gives them a rush and feels good. They're not sick. They're just lacking in conscience. They're callous, but they're very sane.
It's a real dangerous combination, right? Well, so I guess maybe this would be a brutal question. Is there treatment for that?
Successful treatments for psychopathy and antisocial personality don't exist.
Hello and welcome back to the Men's Therapy Podcast. I'm your host, Marc Azoulay, and I'm here with Dr. Peter Salerno. He is the author of The Nature and Nurture of Narcissism, and he's an expert on personality disorders and psychological evaluation. So I'm really excited to talk to him today and cut through some of the noise that you hear online so we can get a real expert talking about these very, very real issues. So Dr. Salerno, welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me, Mark.
Yeah, so I just want to dive right in, right? Like, I'm curious from your perspective, because I've seen ever since COVID, I think the word narcissism specifically has been thrown around a lot online. I think, psychopath, sociopath. I mean, people are shooting from the hip with all these like really intense diagnoses, right? So I'm curious, like, what you make of that, of someone who's really built their career understanding these clinical health, mental health diagnoses.
I think in one way it's pretty cool that there's a lot of awareness. These types of disorders were the ones that were considered exiled and difficult to classify, even diagnostically, because they're not responding to the same, treatments as other conditions. And it was just, they were sort of these oddball, what do we do with them? They were originally put even on like a different axis in diagnostic manuals. Like, we'll just put them over there until we get more data. But I think because of the lack of understanding too, I think that the social media and the general public kind of started building more awareness by like protesting like a lot of things that weren't considered harmful. And so, I mean, yeah, in some ways it's kind of crazy how often we hear these terms and how much they've blown up and they've become part of like common discourse, common language. I do think it's a good thing though that people are aware that these conditions exist and kind of what to expect when you interact with someone who really does meet the criteria for one of these conditions.
I'm curious when you dive into the word condition, right? Because I agree with you, right? But I think with a lot of the social media discourse, it's like, oh, this person's like just an asshole, right? Or this person is, just trying to manipulate and control you. But I think when you use the word condition, you're really highlighting the fact that this person on some level is suffering, right? I mean, they have an ailment, right? There's something that's off.
I think one of the hardest things for people to understand about like narcissists, for example, is yes, it's true that they have emotions, they do suffer, but they don't necessarily suffer in a way that would make sense to other people, right? I mean, the suffering is very self-referential, it's very self-pitying, it's very much preventable. A lot of it has to do with entitlement and things like that. So, but yes, I mean, I do believe that you reach a point where you have to say that something is, deviates significantly enough that it's a condition or a disorder. It's not just somebody who's, different. I don't believe it's just people kind of walking around I actually think that narcissism is a pretty sophisticated operating system in some ways, and then very kind of primitive in other ways. But there's a lot to it.
Yeah, so let's dive right in, right? Because I'm curious, what makes a true narcissist? I'm also curious if you have the stats on hand, like how prevalent is it really? Because again, I think it's one of those things where online, it's like every man has narcissism and every woman is borderline, right? And like, that's obviously not the case, but I'm curious, like where that line is from a clinical standpoint.
Some research as far as prevalence estimates of all personality disorders in the population estimate like 15 to 19%. And then narcissism itself is sort of like a 1 to 6%. But that's still, I mean, that is a lot of people. I mean, we'd be talking about diagnosed ones, not ones that are necessarily just walking around undiagnosed. So then that increases. But I mean, it's fairly prevalent that there's people in the population who their interpersonal style of, is just problematic, and it's going to consistently be. And so what you're looking for in a narcissist is you're looking for somebody who is extremely invested in themselves, but mainly in the way of their image, how people are going to perceive them, not actually invested in their authentic self, right? So you see someone who is very appearance focused, somebody who really does desire being admired and, praised and idealized, somebody who expects other people to be perfect, somebody who feels entitled to special treatment, and somebody who actually lacks the ability or even the desire to consider the needs and feelings of others. So the lack of empathy, you hear a lot about that with narcissism and with NPD. There's a lot more to it. And there's a lot of different traits that are probably worth exploring to kind of really understand like what the operating system is of a narcissist.
So what are some of those traits? Like if you're looking from the outside in, what are some of those identifying traits that you might be able to diagnose using?
The central feature of like grandiose narcissism, what we typically refer to as narcissistic personality disorder, the central feature of that would be characteristic grandiosity, which is an exaggerated sense of self-importance to the point of there's no such thing as equality. It's this sincere belief that this person is superior to everyone else, right? That's the central feature, because being that grandiose means that everyone else is beneath you. So there's a condescending, devaluing attitude. It's antagonistic. It sabotages, it exploits. And so it's not enough to just say someone has a big ego or they're grandiose. Like there's so much that grandiosity entails. But that would be the main feature of somebody that we would describe as narcissistic, is we'd want to know the degree of the pathological degree of the grandiosity, and then the lack of equality.
How do you judge that? I mean, how do you does that come out in self-report or in interviews? Like, how do you assess?
I mean, sometimes it's covert and concealed, like they're trying to manage an impression. So a lot of ways that they'll do that is they'll do a lot of admissions of vulnerability and things to kind of gain your trust, to kind of like maybe, see, they're being very vulnerable, they're not holding back. Therapists love that, or people love helping people. And they're giving you some things that there's some truth to, but it's not really that important maybe. So the way that you tell is you really just look for patterns to converge, like in their lifespan. Like if you have a key informant who can give you information, like actual observational data of this person, they also do reveal a lot of it themselves without knowing it. But there's kind of other things that you need to look for other than just their language and the words they use. There's things that they're not aware that they're giving off sometimes in clinical settings. They don't always know that it's the grandiosity and the arrogance sometimes convinces them that they can't ever be caught in something. So they kind of slip up and get a little bit lazy.
Yeah. The question I have is how much of that is conscious and intentional? How much of that is reflective or, or reactive? I imagine it's different for every person, but I think the way it's talked about and what I'm hearing in you, it's like a game, right? It's like a very active strategy. And I'm curious, how much of that is true.
I personally believe that there's a significant amount of intentionality to it. I see it as a social strategy in relationship context rather than like something that's a compensation for low self-esteem. That's a very popular idea about narcissism. It seems to me that these individuals, it's not that they aren't aware what they're doing, it's that they don't care enough to change it because it's actually working for them. And that lack of empathy does them a service because they don't reflect on whether it's right or wrong or whether someone's hurt. They get to kind of just move forward. So this actually is a strategy that is often immune to distress and internal conflict because it's almost ideal. They don't want to give that up.
Yeah, it sounds like it's a very utilitarian almost, right? It's like if they're getting their needs met, if they're getting, in a lot of relationships, it's sex or it's money, right? Or it's the attention and the praise, like you mentioned before, right? Like, it's like, why change it? What's the motivation for change?
Well, I will say some of it's reactive too. Like I think they don't have like I was talking about the no, there's not a sense of self really, because they're putting all their energy and investment into something that's kind of a facade. It's just to get a response. There's no depth to it. When I say that it's reactive, what I mean is people are going to pierce that kind of thin veil, and so they're going to get injured. You know, they're actually often startled or shocked that somebody could have a problem with them because they're really not interested in, they're not observing other people's emotions in that kind of way, only in a self-referential way. So sometimes it gets to the point where they get bruised or wounded or humiliated, and so they get reactive. But when it comes to like the manipulation to gain the advantage in the first place, it operates a lot like a subjugation system, like an authority that's going to come in and sort of maneuver in order to gain control, and then maintain that position in the relationship. So one person has subjectivity, and then the other person or people always are just kind of objects.
Yeah, let's dive in on that a little bit more of like how that plays out, what the manipulation can look like. You know, I know the classic one that's talked about online and that's diagnosed as, you know, gaslighting, right? Of essentially just lying or trying to force a reality that is not real into a relationship or into a situation. But I'm curious, yeah, what examples you have or how that plays out in a relationship with other people.
Well, these people are really good ones, are charismatic and charming. There's like an allure to them. So, you know, you mentioned gaslighting. I mean, that's a form of a covert tactic to maneuver. But what these people are really trying to do is like, they want you to be certain about them in a way that works for them, right? So they know how to seduce you. They know how to bait you. They know how to mirror you so that you kind of earn their trust, and then they can sort of control you in this way. So it can start off very subtle, and gaslighting is sort of a thing that starts to happen sometimes when you start to investigate things that don't add up. You know, like oftentimes it's not proactive. That's a more reactive thing. Someone might say, hey, you know, you said that you were here, but, you know, lo and behold, there's some evidence that you actually were not there at all. Like, did you get the day wrong? Or, oh yeah, I must have gotten the day wrong. Don't worry about it. Like, you know, and then there's a sort of like, well, actually, I know you couldn't have gotten the day wrong because here, and they go, oh yeah. And then they just keep distorting the reality enough that you don't feel like there's any resolution. Now it's very ambiguous and uncertain, but you stop trusting that you actually saw what you saw, right? So that's something that's kind of intermittently put in, like, you know, when an opportunity presents itself. There's other things though, that there's these kind of intentional, almost like predatory tactics to get people to disarm people and get them to kind of give away their autonomy fairly quickly, you know, through manipulation and things like that.
Yeah, I mean, like, what are some of those? I'm curious, some examples.
Well, I mean, there's actually such a thing in, you know, we talk about this with some malignant narcissists, some psychopaths, sort of preferential predatory targeting, where they study someone in advance and kind of almost like stalk them, get a lot of information about them, so that when the first encounter happens that they set up and arrange, the person almost feels immediately like they've known them for a very long time, right? So, and then comes what's kind of colloquially referred to as the love bombing stage, where they just start showering you with like all of the things that you would want in an ideal partner, and it feels like it's, you know, something new and novel, and it's exhilarating, and they start to kind of biochemically manipulate you and get you quickly attached to them because of this sort of intensity. So a lot of it is this charisma, but then they can start disarming you so much that they start to shape what your reality is. And I think for a lot of them, that is the goal. They just feel like they're in a better position when they can really pull the strings, so to speak.
Yeah, like, I'm so curious about that, you know, because I do think, like, you know, I went to a very like super left-leaning counseling school, right? And I was definitely sold the idea that these people are really injured and they have low self-esteem, like you said, and that they're like victims to this condition, you know. And I think what you're presenting and what I've seen, and you know, I guess for our listeners, you know, Peter has worked on the Ted Bundy tapes and worked with, like, you know, psychopathy and serial killers, right? And people that are, you know, evil in some way, right? It's like, I think there's also this other side of the coin that isn't talked about as much, where I'm hearing you say it's like about control and dominance and like playing with your food almost, right? To use a kind of predatory language. It's not just like, oh, this person is so sad and miserable that they need control to feel safe, right? It's like there could be an actual, evil, I guess, or yeah, malevolent element to it. Is that, am I hearing you correctly on that?
Well, I'm saying that, yeah, there's some people exist with relational strategies that we have collectively decided they're morally wrong. I mean, because they're wanting to engage in things that would harm other people and have severe consequences, but they don't really see that as a problem. Those individuals are actually, they're wired a bit differently, and the communication networks and things in multiple systems in the body are not functioning in a way where it's producing like the typical pro-social emotions most of us assume that everyone has, right? And you mentioned earlier kind of the compensatory philosophy of narcissism, making up for the low self-esteem and the insecurity, and this is a mask because of all the shame. Historically, that was the most popular theory. It also makes sense why it's been so repeated and why it's stood the test of time, is because it's not really something you can prove or disprove. It's based on anecdote, right? So you go in assuming that this might be the cause, and then if the person reports to you, oh yeah, I was mistreated in that way, that explains why I do what I do. You hear that from enough people and you start to think, well, yeah, this might be the cause here. There's some associations to that, but I think it's important for people to know that there are a large group of these individuals who aren't going out and offending others because they're compensating or reenacting their trauma, or they have unresolved pain or wounds that are getting externalized with bad behavior. Some of these individuals are actually really pleased with themselves, and they like their self-concept, and they like their lifestyle, and it kind of gives them a rush and feels good. And so they're not like suffering inside in the ways that people might think. I wouldn't jump the gun and just assume that if somebody's misbehaving, that it's because they're defending themselves against pain. I think we need to also consider the possibility that there are offensive tactics and strategies people use to get ahead in relationships and in other ways as well.
Right. Yeah. And they're seeking pleasure, right? Or they're seeking status or whatever, right? And it's like a competitive edge. It isn't just, trauma being enacted.
No, I think some people crave those things more than others. Like, I think there's some people, and it's not necessarily their fault, right? But I think it is their responsibility to correct any extremes of it. But I think I do believe that people, well, it's not that I believe it. There's evidence that people can be born with higher levels of different traits, psychological traits that give rise to systems that demand more reward or more sensation or more dominance or more attention. And so some of this is just the randomness of our brains and how the different traits and the variation of traits. But, at the more extreme levels where we start to see it as disordered, it can be very dangerous for people to be involved with these individuals.
I'm curious, are there any biological or like genetic markers, and I'm thinking of overlap between, people that have genes that make them more susceptible to addiction, for instance, right? Or maybe even neurodiverse individuals, people on the autism spectrum that also suffer with empathy, right? Have like less empathy when tested. Like, is there overlap between those categories or those type of people?
Well, I mean, very recently, within the last 20 years, there's been a large body of research coming out talking about like the necessity of recognizing the genetic factors that contribute to these types of disorders, that concordance rates among twins, and heritability estimates in populations related to like the genetic influences, that these are highly influenced by biological underpinnings and genetic differences. So factoring that in is really important too, because it informs future treatment. We've been, historically trying to treat these individuals as wounded. And so you give them wounded treatments and they actually exploit those. This data that, maybe we have to find another way in to correct the cognitions that are making people, miserable and hurting people. It's promising, because when it's more of an organic kind of a deal, there's more ways to test it and measure it and figure out the results versus just kind of this philosophy that, oh, it's probably trauma that led them to do this in some way. And if you love them enough, they'll just start to understand and the hole will fill.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, so what would those treatments be like? Is there medical intervention, or is it like a different type of therapy? Maybe more like, I don't know, strict boundaries or rigid ways of being or something, or like maybe kind of more of a tough love type situation? Like, what would that look like? Because I agree, right? Like, I think traditional talk therapy doesn't work with these disorders. And I know there's a number of supervisors. I had some that said, hey, if they're access to, like, refer them out. Like, we literally can't do anything for that, for any personality disorder. But that's pretty disheartening, right? I mean, just being like, there's nothing you can do is shitty.
I think there's nothing you can do in the sense of the tools that we have don't typically work. But there's some other structured therapies that are, according to some experts and specialists who treat personality pathology, are very promising for not necessarily curing something, but sort of creating enough structure of self, like teaching the person how to cultivate self, how to start realizing that, hey, it's in your best self-interest to do something differently rather than don't do this, it hurts others. It's got to be more self-referential. And so some of those treatments that have been promising are mentalization-based treatment used for like some personality disorders, schema-based therapy.
Can you define those terms? Can you say more about what that would look like?
Part of being able to attach to other human beings is to really be able to understand what's going on in their mind and also understand what's going on in yours. And there's a perceptual distortion in personality disorders where that mentalizing component where you can be attuned to someone, it's actually not there. So that's also one of the reasons why there's a lot of conflicts, is they just can't seem to align. The realities are so completely different, and both people are insisting that theirs is correct. And so that's why it's really hard to relate to these people, because if they're wrong, they're not gonna give up until you admit you're wrong, even if you're right. So what mentalization does is it's designed to help them develop the capacity to, like, not just pretend or mimic, but to actually, engage and attune to other people in a way where you can really not just empathize, but really understand things on multiple levels, understand their cognition and their perception, and that it makes sense to you, right? Versus it being something that you're going to be combative with. The schema-based therapy is more like installing new beliefs that are more adaptive in relationships so that they develop the habit of believing something that's more like pro-social versus antisocial. There's not really one particular modality or method, but basically what these things do is they don't have the personality disordered patient go into their past at all. They kind of handle things like in the here and now. It's very confrontational in the sense that things are going to be pointed out as like observations, like versus more that you're not asking a lot from them, like as far as how they feel about things or that sort of deal. Less interpretation and more kind of this structured way to get them literally thinking in ways that would be in their best interest to think, because the way they think now is problematic and they don't seem to think it is. So it's tricky, but and then a very firm treatment frame with expectations of plenty of dropouts and repairs and that type of stuff.
It sounds like it's kind of like selling them on empathy. You almost have to convince them that it's a better strategy, right, to be pro-social and to be empathetic, and that their current strategies are not working. So it sounds like it's very like top down in that way.
Yeah, and then you have to credit them for coming up with it, like so that they hold it as like, I figured this out, And
I figured out the optimal strategy, right?
Right, like in a pragmatic way, that's important enough to them. I think if they were going to take it, then you should give that, you could give that to them.
Yeah, well, so you talked about dropouts, and I know that's another thing where it's like these individuals don't go to treatment, right? I mean, maybe they're dragged there in couples counseling in a way, right? But like they often don't think anything's wrong, so they don't have motivation to go to therapy or certainly to commit for, I'm sure the years it takes to really be effective. So what do you do about that?
I had experiences of encountering these individuals in settings where that's not what they were there for, but they ended up having to go. So maybe mandated counseling for like drug and alcohol treatment, maybe like avoiding jail for 30 days, going to a, and in those settings, you see a high population of personality disorders. They're just not there for that. I mean, they're not calling it that. Some other form of delinquency or something. So they do end up in treatment, is my point, a lot. I think other ones that are even high functioning, they do go to therapy, but they don't go under that, guys. They go because everybody else is causing them a lot of problems, and they go for stress or depression. And they say they think they've been drinking more because they're depressed because everybody's driving them crazy. And you can then start to see, if you know what to look for, you can start to see, their traits and tendencies kind of unfold in the dynamic with you. Start to see their devaluing qualities and sort of these things that don't have anything to do with depression or stress, more with personality and temperament.
Yeah, so you can kind of pick it out and then pivot, your treatment to match that. Because yeah, I agree, right? It's like they come because they got in trouble, right? Or the strategy didn't work and it blew up in their face in an often catastrophic way.
Like I've heard a lot of them, they're in between jobs is what they say, and they're stressed because, and what really happened is they're not in between jobs. They got fired, and they're not telling you that detail. So they're just telling you how stressful it is to look for new work, or some crisis. They got caught in extramarital affair or some sort of a betrayal, financial or something. Their kids will no longer talk to them, something like that. And then they feel like their life is like blown up beyond repair. And so they need someone to kind of get some perspective, but they're not really going to offer anything that they've contributed to this disaster. It's really going to sound more like their world just crumbled and they have bad luck. And it's going to sound vague too, because they're intentionally not giving you much. So there's a lot of ways to look for what's being said and not said, and in the way in which it's being communicated.
And what I'm hearing, it's like a lack of accountability, right? Or lack of self-reflection. And I'm curious if you can speak to that kind of dichotomy, because that's one of the things that I look for in my narcissistic clients, right? It's like this like victim mentality, right? They feel like they're victimized by the world and by everyone around them, but also they think they're superior to everyone around them. And it's a really weird kind of mind fuck to hold both those things simultaneously.
It is. And I think one of the reasons that it is hard to hold both is because there is a sincerity to them believing they're the victim. That's actually not BS. I mean, some of the theatrics might, be BS, a little bit inflated, but I think they can simultaneously feel entitled to do something horrific to someone and also believe that they were victimized. Which is I don't think brains know what to do with that, even a trained one. So it really does make you feel like something strange is happening. But I think that they're sincerely convicted that they were wronged, even like when they are arrested for murder. Like psychopaths, antisocials, they really feel it's unjust.
Exactly. Yeah. Or they talk about how many people have power over them and how, they don't have a choice and they have to do X, Y, and Z. And then in the same breath, we'll often talk about how everyone else is stupid and they don't see the real truth and they're like not as smart as they are. And they've got everyone wrapped around their finger, like it's this crazy kind of bind that I think a lot of them find themselves in. So I'm curious, from the internal experience, I think we're talking about that. We're talking about external now, but from the internal, it's like, I'm gonna ask this question. Like, how do you know? I guess, how do you know if you're a narcissist or if you have narcissistic personality traits or something? Because again, I think the word gets thrown out a lot. And I think a lot of guys are asking themselves, like, is this true? Like, am I this person? Like, how can you tell, or can you tell? Does it take, a professional and outside of professional? Can you tell from the inside, or is it too much of an echo chamber?
I think that people would if they invested a lot into it, they could probably get better at identifying some traits and patterns and sort of seeing them converge in someone in their personal life. And they wouldn't need like the diagnostic criteria. You just kind of see it. And then you could estimate the likelihood that it would continue when you try to intervene and ask the person, will you collaborate to change? So I think people can come to those, they can have enough confidence to identify that in that way. People are going to be probably reporting to you often that there are things that are like problematic with the way you are. I mean, the internal experience of a narcissist. But my point is, a lot of people are going to walk around with reactions to life that look superficially similar to maybe like a narcissistic behavior or trait, and it wouldn't be the same thing. So it's really important too to kind of like identify and define what we mean when we say narcissism. I think internally, narcissists are really believing a version of reality that just can't actually be shared with other people. And it, I think, is genuinely frustrating for someone like that. But it's so frustrating for them that the frustration is there's no accompaniment of even concern for other people, right? It's really more like, I just need to be able to serve myself in this way, and everybody needs to just understand. And I don't know why, nobody understands. So there's internal conflicts in narcissists, but they're different types of conflicts. They're related to like usefulness and utility rather than worth. They value things based on how useful it is, including themselves, which is why they value success. You're more useful according to them if you are more successful. So relating to a narcissist sort of feels like you're not gonna exist in interaction. Like two people cannot coexist in it. The narcissist is the only one who possesses the subjectivity. I think it feels very normal to the narcissist that they're comfortable in their skin, just the way like an introvert might be comfortable being introverted, right? It's like they don't think it's pathological. They might modify their environments accordingly because of it. And narcissists do the same thing. They kind of operate as if this is the way things are supposed to be. And so there isn't a lot of self-reflection in a narcissist. There's a huge difference, though, too, between people disagreeing and relational conflict that I think is often referred to as narcissistic behavior and actually like something that is narcissistic pathologically.
For sure. And one of the things that I feel as therapist and I tell people is like, if you feel completely annihilated or objectified, and I think it's like a felt sense where you're with somebody and you're like, oh, I could be anyone. This person is just like kind of talking to like a brick wall right now, and it's really is about them. And the only time it's actually relational is like if I challenge them or if I say something that's like off script in a way, or if I disrupt the system. And then that person can often get very like aggressive or very defensive or very like, the manipulation kind of comes out, but like until it goes off script, it's like, you could be anyone because it's not really about you, right? They're not like telling you something. They're just kind of doing whatever their patterns are. And you just happen to be kind of an audience for them operating.
I experienced a lot in therapeutic settings with these individuals. All of a sudden there's like a sense of feeling incompetent. Like you can't do your job, because what a lot of people don't realize about these people is even when they might be charming you, if they're truly narcissistic, they have that demeaning nature, like running underneath the system all the time. It doesn't come and go like a symptom. It's a characteristic. So even when they're ingratiating or winning favor or pretending to collaborate and smiling and telling you how great you are, they're also like simultaneously like tearing you apart. And you feel that even though it doesn't match so it's very confusing to be around these people. I've often said like a lot of times what tips me off is I get this feeling that of like this dread or impending doom, like gut feeling that I'm supposed to be paying attention to something that I don't see. And it comes just within a few seconds of sitting down with somebody who apparently is trying to deceive you or, gain some sort of advantage. It's interesting what the body will kind of do.
Yeah, it's kind of like the wolf in sheep's clothing thing. We're like, oh, there's like something else happening here. Or like, we're not really friends. Like this person's being friendly, but like there's like they're hiding a knife behind their back or something, right? Like there's some threat that I'm not quite aware of yet.
To me, those are also like a tip off or like a sign that when you have that you're dealing with something that is like personality trait based rather than like trauma based, because those types of feelings typically don't come up when someone is symptomatic with trauma. You don't feel like they have a knife behind their back. That just doesn't register. Your like deception detection network in your brain doesn't start doing things because it makes sense, right? Which is another reason why I think it's important you certainly don't want to say that trauma doesn't matter with personality disorders or that environment doesn't matter, but it's important to start seeing how much of this could be, just sort of variations in natural kind of inherent traits that just kind of, in some people, are at the really high end of the continuum.
Yeah, and I wonder if it's passed down, because I think so much what you're talking about is like, it's like mindset and perspective. So if you have narcissistic parents and they're trying to explain the world to you, right? They're probably going to explain it through the lens of a narcissist, right? So you kind of get conditioned into it.
Absolutely. Well, and also, actually in the most recent DSM, they started to kind of include some of the genetic research. And one fact about borderline BPD is it's 5 times more common in first-degree biological relatives. So, I mean, there is definitely there's a component to it that it can be, transmitted, or some of the traits or features can be transmitted across, generations. I think that could be the case in any family, to be honest. I don't think it's necessarily that it's exclusively like something that runs in families, like two parents can have a child who has, ADD or autism, and they don't necessarily have it. So a lot of that's just kind of random when it comes to some of these traits, but yeah, there is a component to it that seems to be pretty clear that there's some genetics involved.
I think I asked a question before half-handedly, so I want to ask it directly, is like, what is the overlap, or is there an overlap with things like the autism spectrum? Because that's where my mind keeps going. I keep thinking about that, because when I think of, again, narcissistic clients, they'll often talk about, when they're open with me, about like planning conversations, right? Or thinking about like, how am I going to say this to this person to get what I want? Or I need to really strategize about like this interview, and what am I going to disclose, what am I not going to disclose, right? It's like, it is very tactical, but I see my autistic patients do kind of the same thing, right? Where they're like trying to figure out, because they're not aware of social cues, right? They're trying to figure out like how to be. They're doing a lot of impression management, a lot of masking, a lot of, trying to read what people think about them and adapting to that. So I'm just curious, like, if there's overlap there, or like what's going on there.
Well, what's interesting is I read an article that was talking about like regions of the brain that are like associated with empathy, and then comparing traumatic brain injuries in that region with autism with narcissistic personality disorder, just to kind of see what's really going on. So whether the region is damaged through like physical trauma, or you're autistic, or you have NPD, there is some sort of a deficit in that region that's like either it's a volume matter issue, or it's a communication issue, or something's not computing. But what they realized is the same region, that even though it's the same region kind of contributing to the same problem, the motivation for it is completely different. So with the narcissist, there is really a sincere lack of interest, and a sincere lack of registering the emotional pain of another person, and not even necessarily a contempt, just like a complete apathy,
just disregard, like it just doesn't matter.
Like a passive, like kind of. Whereas with autism, that's not the case. There actually is there's an internal conflict, and the inability to like see or explain the picture in the way that it needs kind of causes it to seem like you don't matter, because they're so invested in that. But there's actually still pro-social emotionality going on in that case. So the motivations do differ, even if the region is kind of producing the same effect, depending on other factors.
It's just cool to look at. Yeah, because I remember, you've probably let me know if this is still the case, but when I was learning, neuroscience basics, they were talking about autism, and specifically, I think more severe forms of autism, being that there is more white matter and less, there's more gray matter and less white matter in the brain. So they could see with like some fMRI scans, and that the brain structure is actually different. Is there anything like that for personality disorder? Can they see, if there's truly like biological difference?
The most research that they've done is on incarcerated psychopaths, psychopathic brains. And according to the research, there seems to be a lot of psychopaths who have structural differences, but it's not in every one. And so it's sort of like Another way to think about that, though, is if it's not a structural difference, it could still be a communication deficit, right? So not all regions communicate well, and then there's just bad structure. Some regions can communicate in some pretty maladaptive ways that might reduce, create hypoarousal when other people are in pain, so that you're not really interested in that. It's not novel to you, or and so we see that in like psychopathic brains. I think with NPD, I think just more of that research needs to be done. There needs to be further research. I don't think anything's like super conclusive yet, except the fact that certain brain regions associated with certain capacities like empathy, impulse control, that sort of thing, have been identified in many scans related to narcissistic. But I don't think there's such a thing as a narcissistic brain. They're not all going to look the same. You know what I mean?
For sure. Yeah. I think we've been talking in this conversation. There's so many different inputs and causes, and it's like nature and nurture and conditioning and all that stuff that like it's difficult. Yeah. Like different causes could cause the same kind of personality structure, right? It doesn't have to all be biological. Well, so I mean, let's pivot a little bit to talking about psychopathy, right? So I'm curious, like, what the modern definition of that is. Is sociopathy, is that still a thing? And is there a difference, or is that changed? Like what differentiates someone that's kind of on that end of the spectrum?
Yeah, it's interesting. So the term psychopath, the reason why it was changed, or people tried to change it, is because it's not very descriptive. It just kind of literally means psychologically sick, and that's not really what a psychopath is. They're not sick. They're just lacking in conscience. They're callous, but they're very sane. They're not ill. So the term sociopath was kind of sort of designed to replace that, because of the way that they, affect or make sick, social, situations. That term kind of morphed, though, into meaning a lot of different things. And so then it actually stopped. It kind of was put on the shelf clinically because it was confusing. And then antisocial was chosen because it's the most accurate of what they actually are. They really do have a contempt for society and for other people, and they have a complete lack of honor and integrity. Their main trait is exploitation, and their deficit is like they don't honor anything. So antisocial is the most like accurate, because unlike the narcissist that I mentioned earlier, where there could be like this passive grandiosity, with psychopaths, there's this active contempt and spite. So they're very vindictive, very callous. They like, inflicting pain on others. They go out and seek ways to do it. They're very predatory.
Is it kind of like the same thing, but more then? Or the same thing, but more predatory, more aggressive? Like you said, it's not really self-seeking. It's more like reveling in destruction. It's not even about them, almost, from what I'm hearing.
The thing is, I mean, there's a expression like all psychopaths are narcissistic, but not all narcissists are psychopaths. They still have this inflated self-importance, but they're a lot less. Sometimes their impulse or desire or need for retaliation might be more valuable to them than their image or impression at some times, whereas the narcissist would always try to safeguard that more than anything else. They might be too arrogant to the point where they become reckless and they get caught because they think no one can catch them, like in so much arrogance that they slip up or underestimate.
I think like the Zodiac killer who's like leaving clues and notes and like kind of is like taunting the law enforcement.
A lot of those individuals, when they stopped getting attention, started antagonizing by sending stuff, and they were very offended that they stopped being talked about. So that's their narcissism, but and also the arrogance of like kind of leaving clues and baiting and kind of playing a game with the system. But I was going to finish my thought on antisocial. So that's what we call psychopaths now, but there's still two different diagnostic descriptions of an antisocial personality disorder and a psychopathic. So it's kind of still confusing. The DSM makes it like a compromise where you can have psychopathy as a specifier of antisocial personality, like antisocial with psychopathic traits. But then there's other manuals other than the DSM that still call refer to it as psychopathy and make a distinction between psychopathy and antisocial. One distinction is that antisocials don't necessarily have the calculated coolness of a psychopath. They have more hyperarousal, so they're more likely to fly off the handle, get caught, be more reactively violent, impulsive, explosive, where psychopaths can be more contained and cold and strategic. That's often something that differentiates antisocial. You can also meet the criteria for antisocial criminal behavior and not necessarily have a psychopathic brain or psychopathic personality. So there's that too. But typically when I talk about this, I typically refer to the 4 cluster Bs, and then I also refer to psychopathy as a separate diagnosis, because you could be a psychopath and not have any criminal behavior or record. It can just be personality traits of callousness and contempt and things like that.
And I think you said this, that they're not sick. Like, is there a psychotic element, right? Like a hallucination or a delusional element to it? And I think of, again, like novice understanding of some serial killers where they would find like, crazy writings, right? Or like ritualistic sacrifices or things that like tend to be, that are delusional in a way.
Well, a lot of them do have like accompanying psychosis, like a comorbid psychotic diagnosis. It's not actually inherent in the criteria for the personality disorder. Like, you don't need to be psychotic, or they do. There is a specification for borderline that some of the dissociative experiences they have could lead to some like temporary psychosis or delusion, kind of losing touch with reality due to the level of stress or aggression they're feeling. But I don't think anything is specifically, there's not a personality disorder where you have to be like mentally ill in the psychotic sense. But there are plenty of serial killers who had a mood disorder or a psychotic disorder that also contributed to some really bizarre beliefs or interesting rituals. And they also had the callous, unemotional traits of a psychopath or like a malignant narcissist. Or
it's a real dangerous combination, right? Well, so I guess maybe this may be a brutal question. Like, is there treatment for that? It sounds like there's some narcissists, there is some hope, right? And there's some treatment. It's difficult, but my gut is like, can you treat psychopathy, or is it something where these people might just need to be like locked away or separated from society or quarantined in some way, shape, or form?
Yeah. So far, successful treatments for psychopathy and antisocial personality don't exist. At this point in history, and the best recourse for, recurrent criminal behavior is confinement, so incarceration, but that's not rehabilitating anything. It's just sort of trying to manage the behavior. The personalities don't change through treatment. Right now, I think the best thing to do is to see if it can be managed and confined. I'm hoping one day there will be some sort of a way to like reduce the the recidivism. They go and they get in trouble and they go and do the same thing again, over and over again. There's no learning from consequences. That would be cool to be able to teach that or install that in some way. But yeah, so that's the one that's kind of doom and gloom. However, I will say there has been research that is very promising for interventions for early detection of these traits in children who are exhibiting more oppositional, defiant, or conduct kind of behavior, that early intervention and like cognitive therapies and things like that significantly can reduce the risk of developing the personality disorder.
That's interesting. Yeah. Can you speak about that, of like, if there's parents listening, like what to look for in your child that might be early traits of either this or other personality disorders?
I have a list of some early warning signs, like for narcissism, in my book, The Nature and Nurture of Narcissism. You can actually see what are referred to as callous, unemotional traits. You can see that trait profile and variations of it, like in children as early as 2, where their play is like probably aggressive and more competitive than fun. They're not maybe necessarily enjoying the play. It's almost like an aggressive act. you could see like some opposition and defiance through like pouting and tantrums that are not related to actual emotional distress, that are kind of manipulative, kind of testing boundaries. I mean, you can see those things. As they get older, they have a terrible time losing, sharing. They don't really have a lot of generational boundary respect. So they don't see their parents as authorities. They see them as equals, or they're above them. So because of the entitlement. Difficulty with relationships because it's dichotomous. Like you're either pleasing them completely, or the child is completely displeased. So friends get kind of discarded easily, and we're not friends anymore. You kind of, I'll never talk to you again. Disproportionate reactions to very basic, simple things like doing chores or school obligations, like really disproportionate, almost like the person acts like they're getting like abused for being asked. Repeated behaviors where discipline actually exacerbates it rather than, reduces it. And this is a sad one, but it's important. Look for nurturing and empathy and connection if it's getting exploited, meaning like if it's getting worse, even though they might actually be kind of pretending to be getting along with you. That's probably that they're exploiting the empathy and the compassion you're trying to model and parent them with. So again, I don't think it's like a doom sentence. Early detection in these interventions showed that structural and functional differences in brains, like pre and post imaging after like cognitive behavioral therapy and mentalization based treatment in kids and adolescents, significant improvement in like reduction of these behaviors and traits. So it's not deterministic, when we talk about genetics, we're talking about probability that there's a higher risk, but not like it's fixed, it's wired, there's nothing you can do except with psychopaths so far. But even that, it's worth early detection and intervention rather than ignoring it as like age appropriate behavior or, something that they'll outgrow. If it seems like it's pretty extreme, you might not want to take the chance of waiting for them to outgrow it.
It's like intervene like early, right? Because it sounds like that's where they're most pliable and you can actually make some meaningful change before it gets cemented. Well, this has been a phenomenal conversation. I'm curious, as our last question here is like, what do you see as the future of this field of personality disorders? What do you hope to see? I mean, where's this whole thing going?
Yeah, so it's kind of interesting because some of my material is a bit counter culture or counter to like a lot of the popular consensus about these disorders. I conceptualize them differently in the sense that I don't think that shame is a prerequisite or requirement to be narcissistic. I don't think that child abuse is a prerequisite to having a cluster B disorder. Like there's things that I think what I would like to see is sort of integration of this new research that's within the last 20 years, the kind of research that we didn't always have access to because we didn't have the technologies we do now. I think it would be cool to have like an integration and understanding these from both, the trauma model that's historically been used, and then also like a brain-based or biologically based model too, because I think it would help inform treatment. If the treatments we've been trying on these individuals aren't working, that means the people that are dealing with them outside in the world are still suffering, and a lot of therapists just kind of want to refer them out because they're dreadful, but maybe there's a way to see it differently so it's not so dreadful and it could actually be intervened on. Wouldn't that be amazing?
Yeah, well, and I like the idea of having like a biological or genetic model because I think by nature these patients are not reliable narrators, so and they're going to change what data they're providing the clinician, right? Which is entirely self-report, right? They're going to change all that to suit their needs, so it's like ineffective by nature.
And we know that there are some people, whether they can help it or not, that they perceive things to be true that aren't true. And so they might perceive that they were unloved when in fact they were treated fairly well. And what do you do with that? Because they're sincerely convicted that their whole life story was this way. And it could be that they're disproportionately understanding what happened to them because there's some biological underpinning that's kind of distorting or elevating something that was really not that big into something that was monumentally traumatic. And I'm not saying that everybody does that. I'm saying that some people do, and clinicians mostly experience that because we see it come in. from time to time. And then there's this also this kind of help rejecting, repetitive complaining where that nothing seems to work and there's nothing you can do, and then it becomes your fault and all that.
Yeah, one of the images that I have in my mind is like, you have the client who's like running the marathon, and they're like, I'm so thirsty, I need water, like I'm gonna die, like I need you to give me water, and you're like, here's the water, and they just won't take it, right? They're just like, no, like why would you give me that? Like it just becomes like defensive.
Yeah, you don't understand.
Yeah, you don't understand. Like that's not what I want. It's like, but
Right.
That's exactly what you're telling me that you want.
Yeah.
It's very confusing and painful to be around. Well,
and I think some of that, I'll end with this. I think some of that is just some unfortunate, like patterned and wiring and coding that can maybe be straightened out if it's understood for what it is.
Yeah, instead of the clinician feeling like they're failing, or like I said, if they just love them more, they get in. But seeing it and calling it out, right, rather than just like trying harder. Well, Peter, really enjoyed the conversation. This was a great time.
Yeah.
As we're wrapping up here, if people want to find you online or they want to read some of your books, what do they look for?
Yeah. So my books are on Amazon. The Nature and Nurture of Narcissism, Traumatic Cognitive Dissonance, and Cruelty by Nature is my latest one. And then I have a website, drpetersalerno.com. I offer workshops and consultations. And then Instagram and YouTube at Dr. Peter Salerno.
Great. Yeah. And listeners, all this stuff will be in the show notes. Just click on the description. You'll see links to all the books and to his website and to social media. So if you're getting a lot out of this, or if you think that there's a narcissist in your life and you want to learn some more, Peter's a great person to follow and to just get educated by. So thank you so much for coming on the show.
Thank you for having me.
And listeners, thank you so much for tuning in. As you know, Men's Therapy Podcast is part of Men's Therapy Online. Website is menstherapy.online. Check that out. We have a ton of free content. There's podcasts forever, blogs forever. And we have a Slack channel, which is like a chat room that we're trying to build up with other men that are talking about these topics, trying to get better, trying to improve. We're up to about 300 guys on there right now. And our goal is to get to 1,000 by the end of the year. So check that stuff out. That's at menstherapy.online. So thank you so much for tuning in, and we'll see you next week, another episode of the Men's Therapy Podcast.